Every day, 5 million people trust the New York City transit system. We board trains without thinking. We stand on platforms inches from the tracks. We sit in buses and cabs with strangers. We walk through crowded corridors beneath the streets, surrounded by thousands of people we'll never know. We assume the person sitting next to us is just tired, just heading home, just trying to get through the day. We assume wrong. The New York transit system is the circulatory system of the city, the veins and arteries that keep 8 million people moving. But sometimes, a clot forms, a blockage, a moment of violence that stops everything cold. And in December, when the pressure of the holidays mounts, when the cold seeps into every corner, when the crowds press tighter and the darkness comes earlier, the transit system becomes a hunting ground. Tonight, we're descending into 7 crimes that turned the commute into a coffin. From the vigilante justice of the 1980s subway to the unsolved carnage at LaGuardia airport, these are the trips that never made it home. We begin with the most controversial case in New York transit history, the shooting that forced America to ask a single, terrifying question. What happens when the commuter decides to bite back? This is Plain Sight Docs, and this is 7 NYC transit crimes that turned the commute into a coffin. The Vigilante of the ERT, December 22nd, 1984. The 2 train, Manhattan. It's a Saturday afternoon, 2 days before Christmas. The subway car is half empty, rattling through the tunnels beneath the east side. The walls are covered in graffiti, tags and throw-ups and spray paint, layer upon layer, years of vandalism that the city has stopped trying to clean. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow. The floor is sticky. The air smells like urine and metal. This is the New York City subway in 1984, and it is a war zone. To understand what happened on the 2 train that day, you have to understand what New York had become by the mid-1980s. Crime was out of control. The murder rate was the highest in the city's history. Muggings, robberies, and assaults were so common they barely made the news anymore. And the subway was the worst of it. In 1984, there were over 250,000 reported felonies citywide. On the subway alone, there were 17,000 reported crimes, an average of 46 per day. Robberies, stabbings, rapes. Every day, commuters descended into the tunnels knowing they might not come back up. The trains were rolling crime scenes. Graffiti covered every surface. Homeless people slept on the benches. Drug dealers worked openly. And gangs of teenagers, some armed, some just looking for trouble, prowled the cars, targeting anyone who looked vulnerable. The police were overwhelmed. The city was broke. The transit authority had no money for security, no money for maintenance, no money for anything. And the people who rode the subway every day, the workers, the students, the elderly, lived in constant fear. Bernhard Goetz was one of those people. Bernhard Hugo Goetz was 37 years old, a pale, soft-spoken electronics engineer who lived alone in a small apartment in Greenwich Village. He was quiet, polite, the kind of man who blended into the background, who you'd never notice on a crowded train. But Bernhard Goetz was terrified. 3 years earlier, in 1981, he'd been mugged in a subway station. 3 young men had surrounded him, grabbed him, and tried to rob him. Goetz fought back and was beaten badly. His injuries required hospitalization. He reported the crime to the police. They did nothing. The attackers were arrested but released almost immediately. No charges, no consequences. And Bernhard Goetz realized something that day. The city wouldn't protect him. So he decided to protect himself. In 1984, he purchased a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, illegally because New York had denied his application for a gun permit. He carried it with him everywhere, hidden in his jacket. He practiced at a shooting range. He imagined scenarios. He prepared. And on December 22nd, 1984, his worst fear became reality. It was around 1:00 p.m. when Goetz boarded the southbound 2 train at 14th Street. The car was half empty. A few passengers were scattered throughout, an elderly woman reading a paperback, a man in a suit dozing against the window, a couple of teenagers listening to a boombox. Goetz sat down near the middle of the car, his back to the window, his hands in his pockets. At the next stop, 4 young men boarded. Their names were Troy Canty, Barry Allen, James Ramseur, and Darrell Caby. They were between 18 and 19 years old, all black, all from the South Bronx. They were loud, laughing, moving through the car with the swagger of young men who owned the space. And they were looking for money. Troy Canty approached Getz first. He was holding a screwdriver, not brandishing it, just holding it loosely in his hand. He walked up to Getz, smiled and said, "How are you?" Getz didn't respond. Canty leaned in closer. "Give me $5. It wasn't phrased as a question. It was a demand. Getz looked up at him, then at the other three, who had moved to surround him. Barry Allen stood to his right. James Ramseur blocked the aisle. Darrell Caby leaned against the pole, watching. Getz later said he could see it in their eyes. They weren't asking. They were testing, waiting to see if he'd comply or resist. And if he resisted, they'd hurt him, just like the men who'd hurt him 3 years ago. Getz stood up, and everything changed. Bernhard Getz reached into his jacket and pulled out the .38 revolver. The 4 teenagers froze. For a split second, no one moved. And then Getz fired. The first shot hit Troy Canty in the chest. The second hit Barry Allen in the back. The third hit James Ramseur in the arm and chest. The fourth missed. The fifth hit Darrell Caby in the spine. It happened in less than 3 seconds. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the subway car. The other passengers screamed, diving to the floor, scrambling for the doors. Smoke filled the air. The smell of gunpowder was overwhelming. Troy Canty stumbled backward, clutching his chest, blood soaking through his shirt. Barry Allen collapsed against the seats, gasping. James Ramseur crawled toward the door, dragging his wounded arm. And Darrell Caby slumped against the pole, paralyzed. Getz stood there for a moment, the gun still in his hand, looking at what he'd done. Then, according to witnesses, he walked over to Darrell Caby, who was sitting on the floor, bleeding, unable to move, and said, "You seem to be doing all right. Here's another." And he fired again. The bullet severed Caby's spinal cord, paralyzing him from the waist down for life. As the train pulled into the next station, Bernhard Getz calmly walked to the conductor's cabin. He told the conductor there'd been a shooting, that he'd been threatened, that he'd defended himself. Then he stepped off the train and disappeared into the city. For 9 days, Bernhard Getz was a ghost. The NYPD had no idea who he was. The only description they had was from witnesses. A white man, mid-30s, glasses, brown jacket. But on December 31st, 1984, Getz walked into a police station in Concord, New Hampshire, and turned himself in. He gave a full confession. He described the shooting in detail. He said he'd felt threatened. He said he'd had no choice. And he said he'd do it again. Troy Canty, Barry Allen, and James Ramseur survived their injuries. All 3 were arrested shortly after the shooting. Police found screwdrivers in their possession, confirming Getz's claim that they'd been armed. All 3 had criminal records. Canty had multiple robbery convictions. Allen had a history of theft. Ramseur would later be convicted of rape and murder and die in prison. But Darrell Caby was different. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He suffered permanent brain damage from the loss of blood. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, unable to walk, unable to speak coherently. His family sued Getz in civil court. In 1996, a jury awarded them $43 million in damages. Getz never paid a cent. He declared bankruptcy. The trial of Bernhard Getz became a national spectacle. The prosecution argued that Getz was a vigilante, a man who had taken the law into his own hands and shot 4 armed teenagers in cold blood. The defense argued that Getz was a victim, a man who'd been terrorized by the city's failure to protect its citizens and who'd acted in self-defense. The jury heard conflicting testimony. Witnesses said the teens had been threatening. Others said they'd just been kids asking for money. But the most damning evidence came from Getz himself. In his confession, he'd admitted that after shooting Darrell Caby the first time, he'd walked over and shot him again, execution style. That wasn't self-defense. That was revenge. In June 1987, the jury reached a verdict. Bernhard Getz was acquitted of attempted murder. He was acquitted of assault. He was acquitted of reckless endangerment. He was convicted of 1 charge, criminal possession of a weapon in the 3rd degree. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail. He served 8 months. And when he walked out of Rikers Island in 1989, he was a free man. The Bernhard Goetz case split the nation down the middle. To some, he was a hero. A man who'd stood up to the criminals who terrorized the city for too long. A symbol of justified rage. To others, he was a monster. A racist vigilante who'd shot 4 black teenagers because he was afraid. The case forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about race, crime, and justice. Were the 4 teenagers victims or predators? Was Goetz a defender or a murderer? And who gets to decide when violence is justified? Bernhard Goetz became known as the subway vigilante. For years, he was a folk hero to some New Yorkers, the man who'd done what the police couldn't. T-shirts were made. Songs were written. He received hundreds of letters of support. But he was also reviled. Civil rights activists called him a murderer. Politicians condemned him. The NDACP demanded justice. Goetz himself became a recluse. He gave a few interviews, then disappeared from public life. He sold his electronics business. He lived off small investments. In 2013, he was arrested for selling marijuana to an undercover officer. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to probation. Today, Bernhard Goetz is in his 70s, living somewhere in New York, still a ghost. But the case he created, the fear, the rage, the question of when violence is justified, still haunts the city. The Goetz shooting changed New York. It exposed the city's failures, the crumbling subway system, the unchecked crime, the desperation of people who felt abandoned by their government. It forced an NYPD to increase subway patrols. It pushed politicians to take crime seriously. It became a rallying cry for the tough-on-crime policies of the 1990s. But it also exposed the darkness in the hearts of ordinary people. Because Bernhard Goetz wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who rode the subway every day. A man who got tired of being afraid. And when 4 teenagers asked him for $5, he didn't give them money. He gave them bullets. The seconds before impact. December 3rd, 2012. 49th Street Station, Manhattan. The platform is crowded. It's a Monday morning, just after 12:30 p.m. Commuters are packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the downtown Q train. Businessmen check their phones. Students adjust their backpacks. A street musician plays saxophone near the stairs, the notes echoing off the tile walls. Everyone is in their own world. No one is paying attention to the argument happening near the edge of the platform. Until it's too late. Ki-Suk Han was 58 years old, a Korean immigrant who'd lived in New York for decades. He worked as a maintenance worker, a quiet man who kept to himself, who took care of his family, who rode the subway every day without incident. On December 3rd, 2012, he was heading home to Queens after a doctor's appointment in Midtown. He'd just gotten off work early. He was tired. He was looking forward to seeing his wife and daughter. He stood near the edge of the platform, waiting for the Q train. And then a man started yelling at him. Naim Davis was 30 years old, a street vendor who sold bootleg DVDs and hats in Times Square. He was homeless, living in shelters and on the streets. He had a history of mental health issues and minor criminal offenses. He was known to be volatile, prone to sudden outbursts of anger. On the morning of December 3rd, Davis was drunk. He'd been panhandling on the platform, asking commuters for money. Most ignored him. Some told him to go away. And then he approached Ki-Suk Han. What exactly was said between Naim Davis and Ki-Suk Han is unclear. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some said Davis was harassing Han, demanding money. Others said Han had said something to Davis first, telling him to leave people alone. What is clear is that within seconds, the conversation escalated. Davis began shouting. Han shouted back. Other commuters started to notice, moving away, creating a circle of space around the two men. Davis was much larger than Han, over 6 feet tall, heavily built. Han was smaller, older, but he didn't back down. He pushed Davis away, and Davis snapped. At 12:49 p.m., as the Q train entered the station, Naim Davis grabbed Ki-Suk Han and shoved him off the platform. Han fell onto the tracks, landing hard on the rails. He scrambled to get up, disoriented, his glasses knocked off. The train was already in the tunnel, its headlights visible, the screech of metal wheels echoing through the station. Han tried to climb back onto the platform. He reached up, his hands grasping the edge, his face contorted in terror. But he couldn't pull himself up. The platform was too high. His arms weren't strong enough, and no one helped him. What happened next is one of the most controversial moments in New York City history. A freelance photographer named Umar Abbasi was on the platform, camera in hand. He saw Han on the tracks. He saw the train coming, and he started taking pictures. Abbasi later claimed he was trying to alert the conductor by using his camera's flash. He said he was running toward the train, trying to stop it, and that the photos were taken instinctively, reflexively, in the chaos of the moment. But the photos tell a different story. One image in particular became infamous. Khan, staring directly at the oncoming train, his body pressed against the platform wall, his arms raised in a futile attempt to protect himself. The headlights of the train are just feet away, bearing down on him. The passengers on the platform are frozen, staring, doing nothing. And in that single photograph, the horror of the New York subway is captured perfectly. A man, alone, seconds from death, surrounded by people who won't help. The train struck Khan at full speed. He was killed instantly. His body dragged beneath the wheels, mangled beyond recognition. The train finally stopped. Half the cars still in the station. Passengers screamed. Some fainted. Others ran for the exits. The conductor, horrified, radioed for emergency services. But it was too late. Khan was dead, and Naeem Davis was still on the platform. Naeem Davis didn't run. He stood there, near the edge of the platform, staring at the train, at the people, at the blood on the tracks. When the police arrived, they found him sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. He was arrested without resistance. At the station, he gave a rambling, incoherent statement. He claimed Han had attacked him first. He said he'd been defending himself. He said it was an accident. But the surveillance footage told a different story. The video clearly showed Davis grabbing Han and shoving him onto the tracks. There was no struggle, no self-defense. It was murder. The photograph of Khan became front-page news around the world. The New York Post published it the next day with the headline, "Doomed, pushed on the subway track. This man is about to die." The image was shocking, graphic, morally complex, and it sparked a firestorm. Critics accused the Post of exploiting a man's death for profit. They accused Abbasi, the photographer, of prioritizing his career over saving a life. Why didn't he help? Why didn't he jump down onto the tracks? Why didn't anyone? The death of Khan forced the city to confront a brutal truth: the bystander effect. The psychological phenomenon where people are less likely to help a victim when others are present. The more witnesses, the less likely anyone will intervene, because everyone assumes someone else will do it. On that platform there were dozens of people. Any one of them could have pulled Han to safety. Any one of them could have jumped down, lifted him up, saved his life. But no one did. They froze. They watched. They waited for someone else to act. And Khan died because of it. Naeem Davis was charged with second-degree murder. The case seemed open and shut. The video was damning. The witnesses were consistent. But the defense argued that Davis had been mentally ill, intoxicated, and provoked. They painted Han as the aggressor, claiming he'd pushed Davis first. The jury didn't buy it. In 2013, after a highly publicized trial, Naeem Davis was convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But the conviction didn't bring Khan back. Khan's wife and daughter were devastated. They spoke at the sentencing hearing, describing a man who'd worked long hours to support his family, who'd never hurt anyone, who'd just been trying to get home. His daughter, Ashley, was 19 years old when her father died. She said she still heard the screech of the subway in her dreams. She said she couldn't ride the trains anymore. His wife, Lee Sun, said she would never forgive Naeem Davis. She said he'd taken everything from her. And she said she would never forgive the people on the platform who did nothing. The death of Khan exposed something the city didn't want to admit. The subway is not safe. People fall onto the tracks all the time. Some pushed, some drunk, some suicidal. In 2012 alone, there were 141 people struck by trains in the New York subway system. 55 of them died. The MTA had known for years that the platforms were dangerous. They'd known that installing safety barriers, like those in Tokyo, London, and Paris, would save lives. But they didn't install them. Too expensive, they said. Not a priority. And so people kept dying. The 49th Street station looks the same as it did on December 3rd, 2012. The same tiles. The same tracks. The same gap between the platform and the train. There's no memorial for Kisa Khan. No plaque. No marker. Just the endless flow of commuters, standing inches from the edge, waiting for the next train. Most of them don't know what happened here. They don't know that a man was pushed, that a man died, that dozens of people watched and did nothing. They just wait and hope it doesn't happen to them. The Trap in the Back Seat. December 19th, 2004. The Bronx, Mount Eden. The clock reads 4:30 a.m. The streets are empty, dark, silent, except for the occasional rumble of a garbage truck or the distant wail of a siren cutting through the frigid December air. This is the graveyard shift. And for livery cab drivers in the outer boroughs, this is the most dangerous time of the night. Giovalin Shikreli is behind the wheel of his livery cab, a beat-up Lincoln Town car with 200,000 miles on the odometer. The interior smells like pine air freshener and stale coffee. The dashboard is cluttered with receipts, parking tickets, and a small photograph of his 3 children taped to the sun visor. He's been driving for 12 hours straight, picking up fares in the Bronx, taking people home from late-night shifts, from bars, from emergency rooms. His back aches from sitting. His eyes burn from the constant glare of streetlights and headlights. But he needs the money. Christmas is days away. He has a wife and 3 children waiting for him in Queens. He's been sending money back to his family in Albania, trying to save enough to bring his elderly parents to America. So he works the graveyard shift, because that's where the money is. And because he doesn't have a choice. At 4:35 a.m., his dispatcher calls. The voice crackles through the 2-way radio mounted on his dashboard. There's a fare in Mount Eden. 2 passengers. They need a ride to the Upper Bronx. Shkreli accepts the call. He's exhausted, but he can't afford to turn down work. He drives to the pickup location, a dark, residential street lined with tenement buildings. The streetlights are out. The only illumination comes from the glow of his dashboard and the occasional flicker of a television in a window above. 2 young men emerge from the shadows between buildings. They open the back door and climb in without a word. Giovalin Shkreli puts the car in drive. And he has no idea he's just sealed his fate. Giovalin Shkreli was 44 years old, an ethnic Albanian from Montenegro who'd lived through wars, poverty, and ethnic persecution. He'd immigrated to New York in 1999, fleeing the violence that had torn apart the Balkans throughout the 1990s. He came with his wife, Liza, and their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, hoping for safety, opportunity, and the promise of the American dream. He spoke broken English. He had no formal education beyond primary school. He'd been a farmer in Montenegro, working land that had been in his family for generations. But in America, farming wasn't an option. So he took whatever work he could find. He washed dishes in a restaurant in Queens for 2 years, working 12-hour shifts for minimum wage. He saved every penny, living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment with his family, sleeping on a couch in the living room so his children could have the bedroom. In 2001, a cousin helped him get a job driving a livery cab. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it paid better than washing dishes. Livery cabs are not yellow taxis. They can't pick up street hails. They work on a call and dispatch basis, serving neighborhoods where yellow cabs refuse to go. The outer boroughs, the projects, the late-night shifts, the dangerous fares. Shkreli works 70, 80, sometimes 90 hours a week. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate meals in his car, usually just a sandwich from a bodega, eaten between fares while waiting for the next call. He saved every dollar he could, sending money back to his parents in Montenegro, trying to bring them to America before they died. His wife begged him to find a safer job. She'd heard the stories, livery cab drivers robbed, beaten, killed. But Shkreli would just smile and kiss her forehead. "I'm careful," he'd say. "God protects me." But on December 19th, 2004, God wasn't watching. The 2 passengers in the back seat were young, late teens, early 20s. They wore dark hoodies, baggy jeans, baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Shkreli glanced at them in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. He tried to make eye contact, tried to read their body language, but they were staring out the windows, not looking at him. "Where you going?" he asked in his thick accent. One of them mumbled an address in the Upper Bronx near Woodlawn Cemetery. It was a long ride, at least 20 minutes at this hour, maybe 30 if traffic was bad on the expressway. Shkreli nodded and drove. For the first few minutes, the ride was silent. The passengers sat in the back, not talking, not moving, just staring out the windows at the empty streets sliding past. Shkreli tried to make conversation, the way he always did, because friendliness sometimes meant a better tip, and tips made the difference between making rent and falling behind. "Cold tonight, yes? You guys coming from party?" No response. "Christmas coming. You do shopping yet?" Still nothing. Shkreli gave up. Some passengers didn't want to talk. That was fine. He'd learned not to take it personally. But something felt wrong. The way they were sitting. The tension in the air. The way one of them kept shifting in his seat, his hand inside his jacket. Shkreli had been driving long enough to know when a fare was dangerous. He'd been robbed twice before, once in 22, once in 2003. Both times, he'd handed over his cash without resistance. Maybe $60, $80. It wasn't worth dying over. But he kept driving. Because what else could he do? Pull over and kick them out? Then they'd definitely rob him. Or worse. So he kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching. They were halfway to the destination, crossing beneath the Cross Bronx Expressway, when one of the passengers leaned forward. "Yo, pull over here." Shkreli frowned. They weren't at the address yet. They were on a dark, industrial block. Abandoned warehouses, chain-link fences, piles of construction debris. No lights. No businesses. No witnesses. "Here?" But we nodded. I said pull over. The voice was hard. Threatening. No room for negotiation. Shkreli's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming. He pulled the car to the curb, his mind racing. Should he run? Should he fight? Should he just give them everything and hope they let him live? The car came to a stop, and the passenger in the back seat pulled out a gun. "Give me everything. Now." The gun was small, a revolver, snub-nosed, black. It looked enormous in the confined space of the car. Joel and Shkreli froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd been through this before. He knew the drill. Don't fight. Don't resist. Just give them what they want. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out his wallet. He handed it back over his shoulder, not looking, not making eye contact. The gunman snatched it, flipped it open, rifled through it. His partner leaned forward, watching. "How much?" The gunman counted the bills. His face twisted in anger. $47. That's it. That's all you got." Shkreli nodded, his voice shaking. "Please. I have family. I have children. That's all I have. Please, take it. Take it. Take everything. Just please, don't hurt me." The gunman stared at him for a long moment. Shkreli could see his reflection in the rearview mirror. The gun, the hoodie, the cold, dead eyes. And then the gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. This ain't enough. The first shot hit Giovalin Shkreli in the chest, just below the left shoulder blade. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp crack that echoed off the windows and made Shkreli's ears ring. He gasped, his body jerking forward, his hands clutching the steering wheel. Pain exploded through his chest, white-hot and blinding. He tried to turn, tried to open the door, tried to escape, but the second shot hit him in the neck. Blood sprayed across the windshield, across the dashboard, across the photograph of his children, taped to the sun visor. Shkreli slumped over the wheel, choking, drowning in his own blood. His vision blurred, his lungs filled with fluid. He tried to breathe, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound. The two passengers climbed out of the car, calmly, as if they'd just finished a routine fare. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They just walked away into the darkness, pockets empty, except for $47 and a dead man's wallet. Behind them, Giovalin Shkreli died alone in his cab. The engine still running, The meter still ticking, the radio crackling with the dispatcher's voice calling his car number. No one answered. At 5:47 a.m., a sanitation worker driving past the industrial block noticed the idling livery cab. The headlights were on. The engine was running, but the car wasn't moving. He slowed down, peering through the window. The driver was slumped over the wheel, motionless. Blood covered the interior, the seats, the dashboard, the windows. He grabbed his radio and called 911. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Giovalin Shkreli had been dead for over an hour. His body was cold. The blood had stopped flowing. His wallet was gone. His cash was gone. The meter read $23.50. The fare had cost him his life. The NYPD treated Shkreli's murder as a robbery gone wrong, one of dozens that happen every year in the outer boroughs. Detectives canvassed the area, looking for witnesses. They found none. The block was deserted. No cameras. No businesses open at that hour. No one had heard the shots. They interviewed Shkreli's dispatcher, hoping to trace the fare. But the call had come from a payphone on the corner of 170th Street and Jerome Avenue. No name. No callback number. No way to trace it. They examined the cab for forensic evidence. They found fingerprints on the back door handles, on the seat cushions, on the window. They found DNA on the headrest where one of the passengers had leaned his head. But when they ran the profiles through the database, they got no hits. The killers had no criminal records, or they'd never been caught before, or their prints and DNA had never been collected. The murder weapon was never found. The $47 was never recovered. For months, the case went cold. Shkreli's family pleaded for information. His wife, Liza, gave tearful interviews to local news stations, begging anyone who knew something to come forward. "Please," she said in broken English, her voice shaking. "Please, if you know who did this, tell police. My husband was a good man. He worked hard. He never hurt nobody. Please." The Albanian community in Queens rallied around her. They raised money for funeral expenses, for the children's education. They held vigils. They marched through the streets with signs demanding justice. But no one came forward, and the killers were never found. In 2010, the case was officially moved to the NYPD's Cold Case Unit. It remains unsolved to this day. Giovalin Shkreli murder highlighted the brutal reality of livery cab driving in New York City. Drivers are completely, utterly vulnerable. They work alone, at night, in the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. They pick up strangers, people they've never met, people they know nothing about, and let them sit directly behind them within arm's reach. They can't see what's happening in the back seat. They can't see if a passenger is reaching for a weapon. They can't defend themselves. They're trapped in a small metal box with people they don't know, their backs turned, completely at the mercy of whoever opens that rear door. And sometimes, that trust is fatal. Between 1990 and 2010, more than 200 livery cab drivers were murdered in New York City. Most were immigrants, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Indians, Albanians, Africans, men who came to America for a better life and found death instead. Most were killed during robberies. Most were shot in the back of the head or in the chest. Most were killed for less than $100. And most of their killers were never caught. The city had known for decades that livery cabs were dangerous. Studies showed that cab drivers were 30 times more likely to be murdered on the job than the average worker. Yellow taxis had been required to install partition barriers in the 1990s, bulletproof plexiglass separating the driver from the passengers. The partitions were controversial, but they worked. Murders of yellow cab drivers dropped by more than 50%. But livery cabs were exempt. The companies that operated livery cabs argued that partitions were too expensive, that they made the cars feel unsafe, that passengers didn't like them. So drivers kept dying. In 2004 alone, 6 livery cab drivers were murdered in New York City. Giovalin Shkreli was one of them. And by the end of the year, his case had been moved to the cold case file. Just another unsolved murder in a city that had stopped counting. Liza Shkreli was 42 years old when her husband was murdered. She was left alone with 3 children, ages 12, 9, and 6, in a country where she barely spoke the language, in a city where she had no family except her husband's cousin. Her husband had been the sole breadwinner. Now, with him gone, she had no income, no savings, no way to support her family. She applied for victims' compensation from the state. She received $25,000, barely enough to cover funeral expenses and 2 months of rent. The Albanian community helped. They raised money. They found her a job cleaning houses. They paid for her rent when she fell behind. They made sure her children had food, clothes, school supplies. But it wasn't the same. Her children grew up without a father. They grew up knowing he'd been murdered, killed for $47, killed by men who were never caught, never punished, never held accountable. Her oldest daughter, who'd been 12 when her father died, dropped out of high school at 16 to work full-time and help support the family. She never went to college. She never had the chance. Her son, who'd been 9, became angry, withdrawn. He got into fights at school. He fell in with the wrong crowd. By the time he was 17, he'd been arrested twice, once for assault, once for drug possession. Liza tried to hold the family together, but the grief and the financial strain were too much. She developed depression. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She never remarried. She said she couldn't. She said her heart died with her husband that night in the Bronx. On December 19th, every year she lights a candle in the window of her apartment in Queens. She doesn't know who killed her husband. She just knows they're still out there, walking free, living their lives, while hers ended on a dark street in Mount Eden. After Shkreli's death, his livery cab was cleaned, repaired, and put back into service. The company that owned the car couldn't afford to take it off the road. It was an asset. It generated income. So they scrubbed the blood off the seats, replaced the headliner, patched the bullet holes in the upholstery, and they put another driver behind the wheel. Then another. Then another. The car is probably still on the streets today, picking up fares in the Bronx, in Queens, and Brooklyn. A beat-up Lincoln Town car with 300,000 miles on it, duct tape on the dashboard, and a history no one talks about. The drivers who've worked that car don't know its history. They don't know that a man was murdered in the front seat. They don't know that his blood soaked into the upholstery, that his final moments were spent choking, gasping, staring at a photograph of his children. They just drive. Because that's what you do when you need the money. You take the fare. You pick up the strangers. You turn your back. And you hope they don't kill you. The fire in the tunnel. December 21st, 1994. The 4 train, Manhattan. It's 3:45 a.m. and the subway's nearly empty. The graveyard shift. The ghost train. The few passengers scattered throughout the car are the kind of people who have no choice but to ride the subway at this hour. Night shift workers heading home. Hospital staff in scrubs. A couple of drunk college kids asleep against the windows. The car rocks and sways as it moves through the dark tunnels beneath the East River, heading from Brooklyn into Manhattan. The fluorescent lights flicker. The wheels screech against the tracks. The air smells like metal and brake dust. At the Fulton Street station, a man board. He's white, mid-30s, wearing a heavy winter coat and carrying a duffel bag. His face is pale, expressionless. He sits near the middle of the car, the bag on his lap, his hands resting on top of it. No one pays attention to him. Just another rider on the late-night train. But inside the duffel bag are 2 mayonnaise jars filled with gasoline, wrapped in cloth wicks soaked in lighter fluid. And in less than 3 minutes, this subway car will become an inferno. Edward Leary was 31 years old, an unemployed computer programmer living in a studio apartment in Flatbush, Brooklyn. He was angry, bitter, resentful. He'd been laid off from his job at a tech startup in Manhattan earlier that year. The company had gone bankrupt, leaving him with nothing. No severance, no references, no prospects. He'd applied for unemployment benefits and been denied because of a paperwork error. He'd applied for food stamps and been told he made too much money from his side work as a freelance web designer, work that had dried up completely by October. He was evicted from his apartment in November. He moved into a cheaper studio in a worse neighborhood. His electricity was shut off. His phone was disconnected. He blamed the government. He blamed the city. He blamed the MTA for raising subway fares while service got worse. And on December 21st, 1994, exactly 10 years to the day after Bernhard Goetz shot 4 teenagers on the 2 train, Ward Leary decided to send a message. He was going to burn the subway. Leary had been planning the attack for weeks. He spent hours at the Brooklyn Public Library, using their computers to research incendiary devices, reading manuals on homemade explosives, studying the layouts of subway tunnels. He experimented with different accelerants: gasoline, kerosene, lighter fluid. He tested homemade fuses in his apartment, using candles and cloth wicks, timing how long it took for flames to spread. He settled on a simple design: 2 mayonnaise jars filled with gasoline, with cloth wicks soaked in lighter fluid. He'd light the wicks, place the jars on the floor of the subway car, and then exit at the next stop before the jars ignited. The gasoline would explode. The fire would spread. The passengers would burn. It was clean, efficient, terrifying, and it would force the city to pay attention. On the morning of December 21st, 1994, Edward Leary put his plan into action. At 3:48 a.m., as the 4 train moved through the tunnel between the Fulton Street and Wall Street stations, Edward Leary reached into his duffel bag. He pulled out the first mayonnaise jar, handling it carefully. He placed it on the floor near the center of the car, wedging it between 2 seats so it wouldn't roll. Then he pulled out a lighter. A nurse sitting a few rows away noticed him. She frowned, confused. What was he doing? Why was he putting something on the floor? And then she saw the flame. Leary lit the wick. The cloth ignited instantly, the flame licking up toward the jar, casting flickering orange light across the grimy floor. He placed the second jar next to it, lit the second wick. The wicks burned fast, 5 seconds, maybe 10. And then Leary stood up and walked calmly toward the door at the front of the car. The jars exploded, not with a loud bang, but with a soft whoomp, a sound like a gas stove igniting, like air being sucked out of the car. And then the fire erupted. A massive ball of orange flame engulfed the center of the subway car, spreading across the floor in a wave of liquid fire, climbing the seats, racing along the ceiling. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. The passengers screamed. The nurse threw herself to the floor, covering her face with her arms. The construction worker jolted awake, saw the flames, and scrambled toward the door, his boots slipping on the slick floor. The college kids tried to run, but were trapped by the fire spreading across the aisle, cutting off the exit. The subway car filled with thick, black smoke, toxic, choking smoke that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. The acrid smell of burning plastic, burning foam, burning gasoline filled the air, and the train kept moving, hurtling through the dark tunnel at 40 miles per hour, the flames reflecting off the curved concrete walls, turning the tunnel into a vision of hell. Inside the burning car, passengers were trapped. The doors between subway cars were locked, a safety feature designed to prevent people from moving between cars while the train was in motion. The MTA had implemented the policy years earlier to stop fare evasion and reduce crime. But now, that policy became a death sentence. People pounded on the locked doors, screaming for help. They kicked at the windows, trying to break the reinforced glass. They crawled along the floor, trying to escape the smoke that was filling the car from ceiling to floor. The fire spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The seats were made of foam and fabric, highly flammable materials that ignited instantly. The walls were covered in advertisements, paper and cardboard posters for Broadway shows, phone services, personal injury lawyers, that caught fire and curled into ash. The floor was coated in years of grime, grease, and spilled soda, which acted as accelerant, feeding the flames. Within 90 seconds, the entire car was engulfed. Flames shot up the walls. The ceiling began to melt, dripping burning plastic onto the passengers below. The windows cracked from the heat, spiderwebbing but not breaking, and the train kept moving. The conductor, sitting in the front car, had no idea what was happening behind him. The subway system in 1994 had no cameras, no real-time monitoring, no way for the conductor to see into the passenger cars while the train was in motion. It wasn't until the train pulled into the Wall Street station at 3:51 a.m. that he realized something was wrong. As the doors opened, passengers poured out of the burning car, coughing, gasping, their clothes singed, their skin blistered, their faces black with soot. Some collapsed on the platform. Others stumbled toward the exits, desperate for fresh air, clawing their way up the stairs. Behind them, the subway car was a roaring inferno. Flames shot out of the open doors, licking the platform, blackening the white tile walls, melting the advertisements on the walls. The conductor hit the emergency alarm. Passengers on the platform screamed and ran for the exits. The fire department arrived within 6 minutes, an astonishingly fast response time. But by then, the damage was done. 48 people were injured in the firebombing of the 4 train. Most suffered smoke inhalation, their lungs seared by the toxic fumes, their airways damaged, their voices hoarse for weeks afterward. Some had second-degree burns on their hands and arms from trying to beat out the flames. A few had third-degree burns on their faces and necks from being too close to the initial explosion. One passenger, a 62-year-old man named Edward J. Mankenti, suffered a massive heart attack during the chaos. He was rushed to Bellevue Hospital, where he remained in critical condition for 3 weeks. He survived, but he never fully recovered. He died 2 years later from complications related to the heart attack. The psychological trauma was worse than the physical injuries. Many of the survivors developed severe PTSD. They couldn't ride the subway anymore. They couldn't be in closed spaces. They couldn't smell smoke or gasoline without having panic attacks. One woman, a nurse who'd been on her way home from a shift at Bellevue, said she had nightmares about the fire for years. She said she could still hear the screams, still smell the burning flesh, still feel the heat on her face. She quit her job. She moved out of New York. She never rode a subway again. Edward Leary didn't run. He calmly exited the train at the Wall Street station, walked up the stairs to street level, and disappeared into the early morning darkness of Lower Manhattan. But he made one critical mistake. He left his duffel bag on the train. Firefighters, after extinguishing the blaze, searched the charred remains of the subway car. They found the remnants of the 2 mayonnaise jars. They found the melted wicks. They found the duffel bag, partially burned but still intact. Inside the bag, investigators found receipts from a hardware store in Brooklyn, dated December 20th, 1 day before the attack. The receipts listed the purchase of lighter fluid, cloth wicks, and mason jars. They also found a notebook, a small spiral-bound notebook with handwritten notes describing the attack in meticulous detail. Edward Leary had written about his hatred of the MTA. He'd written about his desire to punish the city for abandoning him. He'd written about the firebombing as a wake-up call, a way to force people to pay attention to the suffering of the unemployed and the homeless. He'd even written his name on the inside cover of the notebook. Within 24 hours, the NYPD had identified Edward Leary. Within 48 hours, they'd tracked him to his studio apartment in Flatbush. He was arrested without incident on December 23, 1994, 2 days after the attack, 2 days before Christmas. At his trial in 1996, Edward Leary showed no remorse. He sat stone-faced in the courtroom, as prosecutors described the terror he'd inflicted. He didn't react as victims testified about their injuries, their nightmares, their ruined lives. He didn't flinch when the judge read the charges: attempted murder, arson, assault, reckless endangerment, terrorism. His defense attorneys tried to argue that he was mentally ill, that he'd snapped under the pressure of unemployment and poverty, that he hadn't intended to kill anyone, just to send a message. But the jury didn't buy it. The notebook was damning. His planning was meticulous. His execution was deliberate. This wasn't a cry for help. This was an act of terrorism. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Edward Leary guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, the judge called him a coward, a terrorist, and a danger to society. Edward Leary was sentenced to 94 years to life in prison. He's currently serving his sentence at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He's been denied parole 4 times. He will likely die in prison. The firebombing of the 4 train exposed the subway's greatest vulnerability: fire. Subway tunnels are narrow, enclosed, and filled with flammable materials. There are no windows, no emergency exits, no way to escape if a fire breaks out while the train is in motion. And if the train stops in the tunnel, if the doors don't open, if the ventilation system fails, passengers are trapped. In a fire, smoke kills faster than flames. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and other toxic gases are released when foam, plastic, and fabric burn. In the enclosed space of a subway car, those gases have nowhere to go. They fill the car in seconds. You can't see. You can't breathe. You can't find the exit. You just die. After the Leary attack, The MTA implemented new safety protocols. They installed fire extinguishers in every subway car. They trained conductors and transit workers in emergency fire response. They upgraded ventilation systems in the tunnels to improve smoke evacuation. They replaced the foam seats with fire-resistant materials. They banned paper advertisements inside subway cars, replacing them with plastic or metal displays. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. If someone wants to start a fire on a moving subway train, there's very little anyone can do to stop it. And Edward Leary proved just how easy it was. All it took was 2 mayonnaise jars, a few dollars worth of gasoline, and a man angry enough to burn. The 4 train still runs the same route it did on December 21st, 1994. Through the dark tunnels beneath the East River, through Fulton Street, through Wall Street. Most passengers don't know what happened here. They don't know that 48 people were burned, that a terrorist set fire to a subway car, that for a few terrifying minutes the tunnel became an inferno. They just ride. They close their eyes. They check their phones. They listen to music. They wait for their stop. And they trust that nothing will go wrong. But every now and then, late at night, on the empty graveyard train, passengers say they smell something strange. Like gasoline. Like smoke. Like something burning. And when they look around, trying to find the source, they see nothing. Just empty seats and flickering lights, and the dark tunnel rushing past the windows. The bomber in the corridor. December 11th, 2017. Port Authority Bus Terminal, Manhattan. It's 7:20 a.m. on a Monday morning. The height of rush hour. The underground passageway connecting the Port Authority Bus Terminal to the Times Square subway station is packed with humanity. A dense, relentless river of commuters flowing in both directions. It's one of the busiest transit corridors in the world. Thousands of people pass through here every hour, moving quickly, heads down, earbuds in, eyes on their phones. Businessmen in suits carrying briefcases. Students with backpacks. Tourists with rolling suitcases, looking lost, blocking the flow. Construction workers in hard hats and steel-toed boots. Food service workers in aprons. Nurses in scrubs. Everyone is in a hurry. Everyone is focused on getting where they need to go. No one notices the thin man in the black coat walking slowly against the flow of traffic. His name is Akadullah. He's 27 years old. He's sweating despite the December cold. His hands are shaking. And strapped to his chest, beneath his coat, is a pipe bomb. Akadullah was born in Bangladesh in 1990. He grew up in a small village outside Dhaka, the youngest of 4 children in a devout Muslim family. His father was a farmer. His mother was a homemaker. They were poor but stable, respected in their community. In 2011, at the age of 21, Ullah came to the United States on an F-4 family reunification visa. His sister had immigrated to New York years earlier and had become a US citizen. She sponsored him, hoping to give him a better life. Ullah settled in Brooklyn, living with his sister and her family in a cramped apartment in Kensington. He worked a series of low-wage jobs, as an electrician's assistant, as a livery cab driver, as a warehouse worker. He was quiet, polite, deeply religious. He attended the local mosque regularly, prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan. His family said he seemed happy, grateful for the opportunity to live in America. But by 2016, something had changed. Ullah had become radicalized. It started online. Late at night, after everyone else in the apartment had gone to sleep, Ullah would sit alone with his laptop, browsing jihadist websites, watching ISIS propaganda videos, reading manifestos written by extremists around the world. He watched videos of beheadings, of suicide bombings, of attacks in Paris, Brussels, San Bernardino, Orlando. He read about the ideology of violent jihad, the belief that the West was at war with Islam, that Muslims had a duty to fight back, that martyrdom was the highest honor. He absorbed it all, and slowly, over months, his worldview shifted. He began to see America not as a land of opportunity, but as an enemy. He began to believe that Muslims were being systematically oppressed, killed, persecuted. He began to believe that violence was the only answer. In November 2017, ISIS released a propaganda video calling for lone wolf attacks during the holiday season. The video specifically mentioned the New York subway system as a target. Ullah watched that video 17 times, and he decided to answer the call. Ullah spent 3 weeks planning the attack. He researched bomb designs on the internet, using encrypted messaging apps and the Tor browser to avoid detection. He studied schematics for improvised explosive devices, paying particular attention to pipe bombs. Simple, effective, easy to build with materials available at any hardware store. He chose his target carefully, the Port Authority corridor during morning rush hour. The corridor was a choke point, narrow, crowded with limited exits. Thousands of people passed through it every hour. If he detonated a bomb there, the casualties would be enormous. He purchased the materials at different stores across Brooklyn and Queens. A metal pipe, battery packs, Christmas lights for the wiring, screws and nails for shrapnel, fireworks for the explosive powder. He assembled the device in his sister's apartment, late at night, while everyone was asleep. He wrapped the pipe in duct tape. He attached the battery pack and wiring. He tested the ignition system. It worked. On the morning of December 11th, 2017, Ullah strapped the bomb to his chest using Velcro straps. He put on a black coat to conceal it. He kissed his wife goodbye. She had no idea what he was about to do. And he took the subway to Port Authority. At 7:18 a.m., Ullah entered the underground corridor connecting Port Authority to Times Square. The crowd was overwhelming, shoulder to shoulder, moving fast. The sound was deafening, hundreds of footsteps echoing off the concrete, announcements blaring from overhead speakers, the distant rumble of trains. Ullah moved slowly, walking against the flow, muttering prayers under his breath. He reached the center of the corridor, the widest point, where the most people would be concentrated. He stopped. He looked around at the faces rushing past him. Businessmen, students, mothers with children, elderly men and women. He thought about the ISIS video. He thought about the martyrs. He thought about paradise. And then he reached inside his coat and flipped the switch. The bomb detonated at 7:20 a.m. There was a flash of light, bright, white, blinding. And then a sharp cracking sound, like a car backfiring. And then smoke. Thick, white smoke poured from Ullah's chest, billowing into the corridor, filling the narrow space in seconds. Commuters screamed. They dropped their bags and ran, stampeding toward the exits, trampling each other in the panic. Some hit the ground, covering their heads, expecting more explosions. Others froze, paralyzed by fear, unsure if they should run or hide. But something had gone wrong. The bomb had detonated, the ignition system had worked, the explosive powder had ignited, but the pipe itself hadn't fragmented. The bomb design was flawed. The pipe was too thick. The explosive charge was too weak. Instead of shattering into deadly shrapnel, the pipe had simply split open, venting the explosion outward as a burst of flame and smoke. The screws and nails, the shrapnel designed to tear through flesh, remained embedded in the duct tape, held in place by the force of the explosion. Instead of a devastating blast that would have killed dozens, it was a controlled burn. The explosion was enough to tear open Ullah's coat, to burn his hands and chest, to fill the corridor with smoke. But it wasn't enough to kill. Ullah collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain, his clothes smoldering, wires dangling from his chest. Around him, the corridor was chaos. People were screaming, running, pushing. Some were injured, trampled in the stampede, hit by falling debris, suffering from smoke inhalation. But no one had been killed by the bomb itself. Transit police officers, stationed just 50 feet away at the subway entrance, heard the blast and came running. They found Ullah on the ground, burned and bleeding, the remains of the bomb still strapped to his chest. They tackled him, handcuffed him, and searched him for additional devices. He was alone. The bomb was crude. The attack was over. But the terror had just begun. Within minutes, the Port Authority corridor was swarmed by law enforcement, NYPD, FBI, ATF, bomb squads, K-9 units, counter-terrorism teams. They evacuated the entire terminal, thousands of commuters forced out into the freezing December morning. Some in tears, some in shock, some covered in soot and debris. They shut down all subway lines running through Times Square. They sealed the corridor. They brought in bomb-sniffing dogs to search for additional devices. Bomb technicians carefully removed the device, still strapped to Ullah's chest. They confirmed it was a low-grade, improvised explosive device, similar to designs used by ISIS and other terrorist organizations. They searched his apartment in Brooklyn. They found bomb-making materials, leftover pipes, battery packs, screws, explosive powder. They found jihadist propaganda on his laptop. They found a handwritten note declaring his allegiance to ISIS. They interviewed his family. His wife said she had no idea. His sister said she'd noticed he'd been distant, withdrawn, spending a lot of time alone, but she never suspected he was planning an attack. His internet search history told a different story. He'd been planning this for months. In his initial interrogation at Bellevue Hospital, where he was being treated for burns, Aqaid Ullah was defiant. He told investigators he'd been inspired by ISIS propaganda. He said he'd chosen the Port Authority because it was a symbol of American infrastructure, a high-traffic target where he could kill as many infidels as possible. He said he'd wanted revenge for U.S. airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. He said he'd wanted to punish America for its war against Islam. He said he'd wanted to die as a martyr, to be remembered as a holy warrior. But he'd failed. The bomb hadn't worked as intended. He'd survived. And now, instead of being hailed as a hero by extremists, he'd be remembered as a failed terrorist, a wannabe martyr who couldn't even build a bomb correctly. Aqaid Ullah's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage showed him entering the corridor and activating the bomb. Forensic analysis confirmed the device was designed to kill. His own statements admitted intent. His defense attorneys tried to argue he'd been coerced by online propaganda, that he'd been mentally ill, that he hadn't fully understood what he was doing. The jury didn't buy it. In November 2018, Ullah was convicted of 6 counts of terrorism, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction, attempted murder, and providing material support to ISIS. In April 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for good measure. At the sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse. He smiled at the victims in the courtroom. He praised ISIS. He said he regretted that the bomb hadn't worked better, that he hadn't killed more people. The judge called him a terrorist, a coward, and a failure. Aqaid Ullah is currently serving his sentence at ADEX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. He will die there. Remarkably, no one died in the Port Authority bombing, but 5 people were injured. 3 suffered minor burns and smoke inhalation. 1 transit police officer suffered permanent hearing damage from the blast. Another commuter was trampled in the stampede and suffered a broken ankle that required surgery. But the psychological damage was far worse. Hundreds of people were in that corridor when the bomb went off. They saw the flash. They heard the explosion. They thought they were going to die. Many of them developed severe PTSD. They couldn't ride the subway anymore. They couldn't go into crowded spaces. They quit their jobs rather than commute through Port Authority. One woman, a teacher from New Jersey, said she had panic attacks every time she walked through a tunnel. She said she couldn't sleep without the lights on. She said she thought about the bomb every single day. Another man said he'd been standing 10 feet from Ullah when the bomb went off. He said he still heard the explosion in his dreams. He said he couldn't be around crowds anymore. The attack didn't kill anyone, but it destroyed lives anyway. The Port Authority bombing highlighted the terrifying reality of modern terrorism, the lone wolf. Aqaid Ullah wasn't part of a cell. He wasn't trained by ISIS overseas. He wasn't directed by a foreign organization. He was radicalized online, in his apartment, alone. He built the bomb using instructions he found on the internet. He chose his target based on propaganda videos. He carried out the attack without anyone's knowledge or assistance, and that makes him almost impossible to stop. There are no co-conspirators to flip, no communications to intercept, no network to infiltrate. Just a man, alone, with an idea and a pipe bomb. And there are thousands like him, radicalized online, living ordinary lives, waiting for the right moment to strike. The FBI estimates there are hundreds of potential lone wolf terrorists in the United States at any given time. They're impossible to track, impossible to predict, impossible to stop. Until they act. The Port Authority corridor was reopened within 24 hours of the attack. The walls were scrubbed. The floor was cleaned. The scorch marks were painted over. And the next morning, thousands of commuters walked through it again, just like they always had. Most of them don't know what happened here. They don't know that a terrorist tried to kill them. They don't know how close they came to a massacre. They just walk, head down, earbuds in, rushing to catch their train. But every now and then, late at night, when the corridor is nearly empty, maintenance workers say they still smell something strange. Like smoke, like burning wires, like something that almost exploded. The Long Island Railroad Massacre. December 7th, 1993. Penn Station, Manhattan. The 5:33 p.m. train from Penn Station to Hicksville is packed with commuters heading home to Long Island after a long day of work in the city. It's a Tuesday evening, cold and dark, just 2 weeks before Christmas. The platform is crowded with the usual rush hour throng. Businessmen in wool overcoats, secretaries in heels and winter jackets, college students with backpacks, construction workers still in their work boots. Everyone is tired. Everyone wants to go home. The Long Island Railroad is a lifeline for suburbanites, the daily artery connecting the bedroom communities of Nassau and Suffolk counties to the economic heart of Manhattan. For many, it's been their commute for decades. They know the conductors by name. They have favorite seats. They've read entire novels on this train, fallen asleep on this train, celebrated promotions and mourned losses on this train. It's routine, mundane, safe, or so they think. Tonight, the 5:33 will become a slaughterhouse. The train is filled with the usual crowd: bankers, lawyers, secretaries, teachers, men in suits reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, women in blazers listening to Walkmans, the tinny sound of pop music leaking from their headphones. A few college students coming home for winter break, looking forward to sleeping in their own beds, eating their mother's cooking. The third car from the front is particularly crowded. Nearly every seat is taken. People stand in the aisles, holding the overhead railings, swaying with the motion of the train. Among them is a man named Colin Ferguson. He's sitting in a window seat near the middle of the car, a canvas bag on his lap. He's wearing a dark jacket, his face expressionless, his eyes staring straight ahead. He's been planning this for weeks. And in less than 30 minutes, he will turn this commuter train into a killing field. Colin Ferguson was 35 years old, a Jamaican immigrant who'd lived in the United States since 1982. He'd been born in Kingston, Jamaica, in 1958, into a middle-class family. His parents owned a successful pharmacy. He grew up with opportunities, with education, with the promise of a bright future. But Ferguson's life had been marked by instability from an early age. His father died when he was young. His mother remarried. The family dynamic became strained. In 1982, at the age of 24, Ferguson immigrated to the United States, settling first in California. He enrolled in community college, studied liberal arts, talked about becoming a lawyer, but he couldn't hold a job. He was fired from multiple positions: a security guard, a warehouse worker, a clerk, always for the same reasons: erratic behavior, paranoia, conflicts with co-workers and supervisors. He blamed everyone but himself. He began to develop a persecution complex, a belief that he was the victim of a vast conspiracy orchestrated by white people, Republicans, and what he called Uncle Tom Negroes, who had betrayed their race. He moved to New York in the late 1980s, living in various apartments in Brooklyn and Queens, always falling behind on rent, always getting evicted. By 1993, Ferguson was living in a single rented room in Flatbush, Brooklyn, surviving on welfare checks and food stamps. He had no friends, no family in the area, no job prospects, and he was consumed by rage. Ferguson kept a notebook, hundreds of pages of rambling, paranoid writings. He wrote about his belief that white people were deliberately sabotaging his life. He wrote lists of people he blamed for his failures: employers who'd fired him, landlords who'd evicted him, government officials who denied him benefits. He wrote about racism, about oppression, about the need for black people to fight back against their oppressors. But his writings weren't political theory. They were the ravings of a deeply disturbed man who couldn't accept responsibility for his own failures. He blamed white people for not hiring him. But he'd been fired for showing up late, for arguing with supervisors, for refusing to follow instructions. He blamed landlords for evicting him. But he'd stopped paying rent, had damaged property, had threatened other tenants. He blamed the government for denying him benefits. But he'd missed appointments, failed to submit paperwork, refused to cooperate with caseworkers. At every turn, Ferguson blamed others. And that blame curdled into hatred. In November 1993, Ferguson traveled to California for a brief visit. While there, he purchased a Ruger .89mm semi-automatic pistol from a gun shop in Sunnyvale. He passed the required background check. He waited the mandatory 15-day cooling-off period. And then he returned to New York with the gun and 160 rounds of ammunition. New York had some of the strictest gun control laws in the country. It was illegal to bring a handgun into the state without a permit. It was illegal to carry a concealed weapon. It was illegal to purchase ammunition without a license. But Ferguson didn't care about the law. He had a gun. He had bullets. And he had a plan. He was going to kill as many white people as possible. Ferguson chose the Long Island Railroad deliberately. He rode it frequently, whenever he had business in Manhattan, whenever he visited friends in Queens, whenever he simply wanted to get out of his cramped room in Flatbush. And every time he rode it, he was filled with resentment. The train was filled with white suburban commuters. People who had jobs, families, homes. People who lived in nice neighborhoods with good schools and low crime. People who, in Ferguson's mind, represented everything he didn't have. He saw them as the enemy, as the oppressors, as the people who'd stolen his opportunities, denied him success, ruined his life. And he decided they needed to pay. He chose the 5:33 p.m. train specifically because it was one of the most crowded, packed with commuters heading home after work, maximizing the number of potential victims. He chose the third car because it was in the middle of the train, giving him the best tactical position. And he chose December 7th because it was a Tuesday, a normal workday, with normal ridership, with no heightened security or awareness. It was the perfect target. On the evening of December 7th, 1993, Colin Ferguson boarded the 5:33 p.m. train at Penn Station. He was carrying his canvas bag, which contained the loaded Ruger pistol, 4 additional magazines of ammunition, each holding 15 rounds, and his notebook. He wore a dark jacket, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would make anyone remember him. He walked through the train, evaluating the cars, looking for the best position. He chose a seat in the third car, near the middle, on the right side of the train. It was a window seat, which gave him a clear line of fire down the aisle. And it was far enough from the doors that passengers couldn't easily escape. He sat down, placed the bag on his lap, and waited. The train pulled out of Penn Station at 5:33 p.m., right on schedule. It rumbled through the tunnel beneath the East River, emerging into the fading daylight of Queens. The city skyline disappeared behind them, replaced by the urban sprawl of Sunnyside, Woodside, Forest Hills. The train made its stops, passengers boarding and disembarking at each station. By the time the train left Jamaica Station, the last stop in Queens, and headed east into Nassau County, the third car was nearly full. Ferguson sat motionless, his hands resting on the canvas bag, his eyes staring straight ahead. Other passengers sat around him, reading newspapers, listening to music, dozing. No one paid attention to him. Just another commuter heading home. The train crossed into Nassau County, passing through the stations of Bellerose, Queens Village, Hollis. At 6:03 p.m., as the train was traveling between the Maryland Avenue and Garden City stations, moving at approximately 50 miles per hour through the dark, residential neighborhoods of Garden City, Colin Ferguson stood up. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out the Ruger pistol. And then, calmly, methodically, he began walking down the aisle, shooting passengers in the head. The first victim was a man sitting in a window seat 3 rows ahead Ferguson, reading the New York Times. Ferguson walked up behind him, raised the gun, pointed it at the back of the man's head from less than 2 feet away, and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, cracking gunshot that echoed off the metal walls and ceiling. The man slumped forward, blood spraying across the window, across the newspaper in his lap, across the seat in front of him. Other passengers looked up, confused. What was that sound? A firecracker? Something falling? And then Ferguson fired again. He moved down the aisle like an executioner, walking slowly, deliberately, choosing his targets, firing once or twice at each person before moving to the next. He shot a woman in the head as she sat knitting, the yarn falling from her hands as she collapsed. He shot a man who stood up and tried to confront him, hitting him in the chest and face, the man falling backward into the aisle. He shot a college student who was asleep against the window, killing him before he even woke up. He shot a woman who was shielding her young daughter, the bullet passing through the mother's shoulder and striking the girl in the arm. He shot an elderly man who was reading a book, the book falling open on the floor, pages soaked with blood. The passengers who weren't hit initially dove to the floor, crawling under seats, pressing themselves against the walls, trying to make themselves invisible. Some screamed. Others were silent, paralyzed by terror. Ferguson walked among them, shooting at anyone who moved, anyone who made a sound, anyone who looked at him. The sound of the gunshots was constant, echoing through the car, mixing with the screams, the sobbing, the wet, gurgling sounds of the dying. Shell casings clattered on the floor, rolling with the motion of the train. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and choking. When Ferguson emptied his first magazine, 15 rounds, he calmly ejected it, letting it fall to the floor with a metallic clatter. He reached into his bag, pulled out a fresh magazine, and slapped it into the gun with practiced ease. He'd been practicing this. He'd trained for this. He kept shooting. Some passengers tried to escape, crawling toward the doors at the ends of the car. Ferguson shot at them, hitting some, missing others as they scrambled out of the car and into the adjacent cars. The conductor in the front car heard the gunshots and hit the emergency brake. The train lurched, throwing passengers to the floor. Ferguson stumbled but kept his footing. He reloaded again, his third magazine now, and continued down the aisle. By now, he'd walked the entire length of the car. Bodies and wounded passengers lay scattered throughout. Blood covered the floor, making it slippery. Ferguson turned around and started walking back the other direction, shooting at anyone who was still moving. That's when 3 men decided to act. Dennis McCarthy, a 52-year-old advertising executive, had been shot in the chest but was still conscious. He was lying on the floor, bleeding, watching Ferguson reload. And he realized, this is the moment. While he's reloading, McCarthy lunged at Ferguson from behind, tackling him around the waist. Ferguson stumbled, dropping the magazine, struggling to hold onto the gun. Kevin Bloom, a 29-year-old teacher, saw McCarthy wrestling with Ferguson and rushed to help, grabbing Ferguson's gun hand, trying to pry the weapon away. Mark McEntee, a 43-year-old businessman, joined the fight, pinning Ferguson's other arm, preventing him from reaching into his bag for more ammunition. The 3 men wrestled Ferguson to the floor, punching him, kicking him, holding him down with all their strength. Ferguson fought back, kicking, biting, screaming incoherently. But the 3 men held him until the train screeched to a full stop and transit police boarded the car. By then, Dennis McCarthy was losing consciousness from blood loss. He would die later that night at Nassau County Medical Center. But his actions, and those of Blum and McEntee, saved lives. Because Colin Ferguson still had 60 rounds of ammunition left. When the shooting stopped, the scene inside the third car was apocalyptic. 6 people were dead. 19 others were wounded, some critically, some with injuries that would leave them paralyzed or disabled for life. The interior of the train car looked like a battlefield. Blood covered the seats, the floor, the windows, the ceiling. Shell casings littered the aisle. Bullet holes punctured the walls and overhead compartments. Survivors sat in shock, covered in blood, some their own, some from the people who died next to them, unable to process what had just happened. Emergency responders arriving at the scene said it was one of the worst mass casualty events they'd ever seen. One paramedic, a veteran who'd served in Vietnam, said the train car looked like the aftermath of a firefight. He said he couldn't believe it had happened on a commuter train in suburban New York. The 6 people killed by Colin Ferguson were James Waricki, 51, a computer analyst from Garden City, shot in the back of the head while reading the newspaper. He left behind a wife and 2 teenage daughters. Mi Kyung Kim, 27, a graduate student from South Korea, studying at SUNY Stony Brook, shot in the chest. Her family in Korea learned of her death from news reports. Maria Teresa Tumangan, 30, a nurse from Brooklyn who'd been working a double shift at a Manhattan hospital, shot in the head while trying to shield her 7-year-old daughter. Her daughter survived with a bullet wound to the arm. Richard Nettleton, 24, a college student from Rockville Center, shot in the temple while sleeping against the window. He died instantly. Dennis McCarthy, 52, an advertising executive from Maninola, who was one of the men who tackled Ferguson, but succumbed to his gunshot wounds later that night at the hospital. He left behind a wife, Carolyn, and a son, Kevin. Amy Federici, 27, a social worker from Baldwin, shot in the head. She'd been planning her wedding, scheduled for the following June. All of them were just trying to get home. Among the 19 wounded was Kevin McCarthy, Dennis's son, who was shot in the head and suffered permanent brain damage. He survived, but would never fully recover. His mother, Carolyn McCarthy, would later run for Congress on a platform of gun control, inspired by the loss of her husband and the injury to her son. She would serve in the U.S. House of Representatives for 18 years. Colin Ferguson was arrested at the scene and taken into custody by Nassau County Police. At the police station, he was calm, almost cheerful. He showed no remorse. He didn't ask about the victims. He didn't seem to understand or care about the gravity of what he'd done. When detectives asked him why he'd done it, he said, "They deserved it, all of them." When they asked him who deserved it, he said, "White people, racists, Uncle Toms, everyone who's kept the black man down." It was clear Ferguson believed he'd committed a righteous act, a blow against oppression. He was delusional, paranoid, and utterly without remorse. When detectives searched him, they found the notebook. Inside were hundreds of pages of racist screeds, paranoid rants, and detailed notes about his grievances. There were lists of people he blamed for his failures: employers, landlords, government officials, even random white people he'd encountered on the subway. There was a page titled "Reasons for This," on which Ferguson had written, "The Long Island Railroad is a symbol of white suburban privilege. The white man has oppressed the black man for 400 years. It is time for the white man to pay. Today I take the first step toward justice." He planned the attack for weeks. He'd chosen the Long Island Railroad specifically because its ridership was predominantly white and affluent. He'd practiced drawing his gun quickly from his bag. He calculated how many rounds he could fire before passengers could react. It was premeditated, calculated, and utterly unforgivable. The trial. Colin Ferguson's trial became a bizarre media spectacle. He fired his court-appointed lawyers, two of the best defense attorneys in New York, and chose to represent himself, despite having no legal training and clearly suffering from severe mental illness. His lawyers had planned to mount an insanity defense. Psychiatrists had examined Ferguson and concluded he was suffering from paranoid personality disorder and delusional thinking. But Ferguson refused the diagnosis. He insisted he was sane. He said he wanted to represent himself so he could expose the racist conspiracy against him. The judge reluctantly allowed it. And so Colin Ferguson, the man who'd murdered 6 people in cold blood, conducted his own defense. The trial was surreal. Ferguson cross-examined survivors of the shooting, asking them to describe how they'd been shot, where the bullets had hit them, what they'd felt. He was forcing them to relive the trauma while he sat at the defense table, smirking. He questioned Carolyn McCarthy, the widow of Dennis McCarthy, asking her why her husband had tried to stop him. "Your husband attacked me," Ferguson said. "Why did he do that?" Carolyn stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "Because you were murdering innocent people," she said. Ferguson seemed genuinely confused by her answer. He called witnesses to testify about racism in America, about police brutality, about systemic oppression. None of it had anything to do with the murders he'd committed. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: eyewitness testimony from dozens of survivors, forensic evidence, the gun, the notebook, Ferguson's own statements to police. The defense presented nothing coherent. Ferguson rambled about conspiracies. He claimed he'd been asleep when the shooting started, and that a white man had stolen his gun and committed the murders. It was an absurd defense, contradicted by dozens of witnesses who'd watched Ferguson shoot their friends and family members. In February 1995, after a trial that lasted 6 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than 10 hours. Colin Ferguson was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 315 years and 8 months in prison, consecutively, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. At the sentencing hearing, Ferguson showed no emotion. He said he still believed he was innocent. He said the trial had been rigged. He said he was a victim of a racist justice system. The judge called him a coward, a murderer, and a disgrace to humanity. Colin Ferguson is currently serving his sentence at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He has been denied parole multiple times and will die in prison. The Long Island Railroad Massacre changed the national conversation about gun violence and mass shootings. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at the time. And it happened not in a school or a workplace, but on a commuter train, a space millions of Americans use every day. It shattered the illusion of safety. Carolyn McCarthy, who lost her husband and saw her son permanently disabled, became a tireless advocate for gun control. She ran for Congress in 1996 and won, serving 9 terms and co-sponsoring numerous gun control bills. But despite her efforts, America's gun laws remained largely unchanged. Colin Ferguson had purchased his gun legally. He'd passed a background check. He'd followed California's laws. And then he brought it to New York and killed 6 people. The Long Island Railroad still runs the 5:33 p.m. train from Penn Station to Hicksville. It follows the same route. It stops at the same stations. It carries the same kinds of commuters, tired, ready to go home, thinking about dinner and family. Most passengers don't know what happened on December 7th, 1993. The railroad doesn't mark the anniversary. There's no memorial on the train. No plaque at the station. Just silence. But some of the survivors still ride the Lear. They have no choice. It's how they get to work, how they get home. They say they can't sit in the third car. They say they can't sit in the middle seats. They say they sit near the doors, always ready to run. Because they know the truth. Safety is an illusion. Evil can board a train at Penn Station. And sometimes, you don't make it home. The Locker Bombing Mystery. December 29th, 1975. LaGuardia Airport, Queens. It's 6:30 p.m., 4 days after Christmas, and the TWA baggage claim area at LaGuardia Airport is packed with holiday travelers. The terminal buzzes with activity. Families returning from visiting relatives in Florida and California. Businessmen heading home after year-end meetings. Tourists arriving in New York to celebrate New Year's Eve in Times Square. The terminal still wears the remnants of Christmas. Fading garland draped along the walls. Half-deflated inflatable snowmen leaning in corners. Strings of colored lights blinking irregularly above the ticket counters. The POS system crackles with announcements about arriving flights, gate changes, lost luggage, ground transportation. The air smells like jet fuel, burnt coffee, cigarette smoke, and humanity packed too tightly into an enclosed space. People stand in clusters around the baggage carousel, watching for their suitcases to appear on the slow-moving conveyor belt. Others sit on benches, reading magazines, smoking cigarettes, killing time before their next flight. Children run between the adults, laughing, chasing each other, immune to the exhaustion weighing on their parents. No one notices the coin-operated locker against the wall near the ticket counter. Locker number 144. Inside is a brown suitcase. And inside the suitcase is a bomb powerful enough to level the entire terminal. At 6:33 p.m., it detonates. The explosion. The blast is catastrophic. The bomb, later estimated to contain the equivalent of 25 sticks of dynamite, explodes with a force that shakes the entire central terminal building. The sound is deafening, a deep, percussive boom that ruptures eardrums, stops hearts, and shatters windows across 3 concourses. The locker disintegrates instantly. The metal door, weighing over 50 pounds, is blown across the terminal like a projectile, decapitating a man standing near the ticket counter. Shrapnel, pieces of the locker, the suitcase, nails and bolts packed into the bomb, tears through the crowded baggage claim area at supersonic speed. It rips through flesh. It shatters bone. It embeds in walls, ceiling tiles, support columns, airplane fuselage visible through the shattered windows. The floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows of the terminal explode outward in a cascade of jagged glass, showering the sidewalk, the parking lot, and the tarmac beyond. The ceiling collapses in sections, raining insulation, acoustic tiles, electrical wiring, and concrete chunks onto the people below. The lights go out, plunging the terminal into smoke-choked darkness. And then the screaming starts. The scene is apocalyptic. Bodies are scattered across the white tile floor, some motionless, some writhing in pain, some torn apart beyond recognition. Blood pools and spreads, mixing with shattered glass, spilled luggage, and debris. A child's stuffed bear lies next to a severed limb. A woman's purse sits beside a growing pool of blood. A businessman's briefcase has been torn open, papers fluttering through the smoke like snow. Luggage is scattered everywhere, torn open by the blast, contents strewn across the terminal. Clothes, toiletries, Christmas presents still wrapped in festive paper, now soaked with blood. The baggage carousel is still turning, the motor unaffected by the blast, but no one is watching it anymore. People stumble through the thick, acrid smoke, coughing, bleeding, searching desperately for family members. Some are missing limbs. Others are on fire, their clothes ignited by the blast. A few walk aimlessly, in shock, staring at wounds they don't yet understand. A woman sits on the floor, cradling her dead husband, rocking back and forth, keening. A businessman stands frozen, staring at his hands, which are covered in blood that isn't his. He doesn't know where it came from. He doesn't know if he's injured. He just stares. Outside, on the tarmac, pilots and ground crew hear the explosion and see smoke pouring from the terminal. They radio the tower. Emergency protocols are activated, but it's too late. The damage is done. Emergency responders arrive within 6 minutes. FD9, NYPD, Port Authority Police, ambulances from hospitals across Queens and Manhattan to Tata. But the scale of the disaster overwhelms them. Paramedics step into the terminal and are confronted with a scene from a war zone. Blood everywhere. Bodies everywhere. The wounded screaming, begging for help. They begin performing triage on the terminal floor, marking victims with colored tags. Red for critical, those who need immediate surgery or they'll die. Yellow for serious, those who can wait a few hours. Green for minor injuries, walking wounded who can be treated later. Black for the dead. There are too many black tags. The dead are covered with blankets and left where they fell. There's no time to move them. The focus is on saving the living. Ambulances line up outside the terminal, sirens wailing, ferrying the critically wounded to hospitals across Queens and Manhattan. Jamaica Hospital, Elmhurst Hospital, Bellevue, Mount Sinai. The terminal is shut down. All flights are grounded or diverted. Thousands of travelers are stranded, some trapped inside the terminal, some evacuated to parking lots and surrounding streets. And in the chaos, one question echoes through every conversation, every radio transmission, every press briefing. Who did this? 11 people are dead. 74 are wounded. Many critically, many with injuries so severe they'll never fully recover. The dead are Frank Berardi, 45, a salesman from Teaneck, New Jersey, killed instantly by shrapnel that tore through his chest and throat. Dorothy Rosenbaum, 61, a grandmother from Brooklyn, killed by a piece of metal locker door that severed her carotid artery. She bled out on the terminal floor while her daughter screamed for help. James Melius, 31, a two-Tebue baggage handler and U.S. Navy veteran, killed while trying to help wounded passengers evacuate. He was struck by falling debris from the collapsed ceiling. Teresa Pagano, 38, a mother of 3 from Staten Island, killed by the blast wave that ruptured her internal organs. She died without a visible wound, internal hemorrhaging that medics couldn't see until it was too late. Harold Munn, 52, a businessman from Stamford, Connecticut, killed by shrapnel to the chest and head. Fernando Betancourt, 29, a tourist from Venezuela, killed instantly near the lockers. And 5 others whose names were withheld at the request of their families. 2 children, a college student, an elderly man, and an airline employee. All of them were just trying to catch a flight, just trying to get home, just trying to start their vacations or end their business trips. And they died in a fireball at LaGuardia Airport for reasons no one understood. The FBI, ATF, NYPD, and Port Authority Police converge on LaGuardia within hours. They seal off the terminal, treating it as both a crime scene and a disaster zone. Investigators in hazmat suits and protective gear begin the painstaking process of collecting evidence. Bomb squad technicians sift through the debris, looking for fragments of the device. They find pieces of the suitcase, a brown Samsonite hardshell, common and untraceable. They find remnants of the bomb itself, metal pipes, batteries, wiring, nails. Forensic experts determined that the bomb was a high-grade explosive device, far more sophisticated than the typical pipe bombs or Molotov cocktails used by amateurs. It had been packed with nails and bolts to maximize shrapnel. It had been placed inside a suitcase to conceal it. The suitcase had been placed inside a coin-operated locker to hide it in plain sight. And the locker had been rented days earlier, possibly as early as December 26th, the day after Christmas. But there was no record of who'd rented it. Coin-operated lockers at LaGuardia and at airports across the country didn't require identification. Anyone with a quarter could use them. You put in your money, took the key, and came back whenever you wanted. It was a system designed for convenience, and it had just been used to commit mass murder. Investigators interview hundreds of witnesses, but no one remembers seeing anyone suspicious near the lockers. The terminal had been crowded for days, thousands of holiday travelers passing through. Hundreds of people had walked past locker 144. No one had noticed anything unusual. No one had seen someone place a suitcase in the locker. No one had heard ticking or smelled anything strange. The bomber had blended in perfectly. The bomb itself offered few clues. It had been detonated with a timing device, a simple mechanical alarm clock, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. Reliable. Untraceable. The explosive material was military grade, possibly stolen from a construction site or military base. It suggested the bomber had training, access to restricted materials, or connections to organized crime or extremist groups. But there were no fingerprints on the recovered fragments. No DNA. No serial numbers on the clock or the batteries. Whoever built this bomb knew what they were doing, and they'd been careful not to leave evidence. In the days, weeks, and months following the bombing, investigators pursued multiple theories about who was responsible and why. Theory 1. Croatian nationalists. In the 1970s, Croatian nationalist groups were waging a violent campaign against the Yugoslav government and its allies. They'd been responsible for bombings, hijackings, and assassinations around the world, targeting Yugoslav embassies, airlines, and government officials. Just 9 months before the LaGuardia bombing, in September 1976, a Croatian group hijacked 2A Flight 355, holding passengers hostage and demanding the release of political prisoners and the publication of a manifesto. The hijacking ended without casualties, but the group threatened further attacks if their demands weren't met. Investigators believed the LaGuardia bomb might have been retaliation for U.S. cooperation with Yugoslav authorities or a warning to Tawai for complying with the FBI during the hijacking. Croatian groups were known to use sophisticated bombs. They had access to military-grade explosives, and they had a history of targeting airports and airlines. But no Croatian group claimed responsibility for the LaGuardia bombing, and no concrete evidence linked them to the attack. Theory 2. The Jewish Defense League, JDL. The Jewish Defense League, a far-right militant organization founded by Rabbi Meir Kahane, had been responsible for dozens of bombings throughout the 1970s. They targeted Soviet offices, Arab consulates, and organizations they viewed as anti-Israel. Their bombs were sophisticated, often hidden in public places, offices, theaters, and coin-operated lockers. In fact, the JDL had a documented history of using airport lockers to hide bombs. Some investigators believe the LaGuardia bomb was meant for a different target, possibly a Soviet or PLO office, but had been placed in the wrong location by mistake, or that it had detonated prematurely. The JDL had the expertise, they had the motive, and they had a history of using similar tactics. But again, no evidence definitively linked them to the attack, and the JDL never claimed responsibility, something they typically did for their bombings. Theory 3. The Mad Bomber Copycat. Some investigators believe the LaGuardia bombing was the work of a lone extremist, possibly inspired by George Metsky, the mad bomber who'd terrorized New York in the 1950s with a series of bombings targeting Con Edison and other corporations. Metesky's bombs had been sophisticated, well hidden, and designed to cause maximum casualties. He'd placed them in public places, movie theaters, subway stations, train terminals. The LaGuardia bomb bore similarities to Metesky's devices. The sophistication, the timing mechanism, the choice of a crowded public space. But Metesky was in his 70s by 1975, in poor health, and had been released from a psychiatric hospital years earlier. He was living quietly upstate and had no known connections to the bombing, and no other bomber with Metesky's profile and skill level had emerged. Theory 4. A random act of terror. The most chilling theory was that the bombing had no specific political motive at all, that it was simply an act of random violence, designed to kill as many people as possible, by someone who wanted to create terror for its own sake. The target supported this theory, a crowded airport during the holiday season. The baggage claim area where people congregated. The timing, 6:33 p.m. during peak travel hours. It was the perfect recipe for mass casualties. And maybe that was the entire point. Not politics. Not ideology. Just death. Over the decades, investigators identified several potential suspects, but none were ever charged. Zvonko Bušić and Julian Bušić, Croatian nationalists, who hijacked Tebio Flight 355 in 1976. Zvonko served 32 years in prison and always denied involvement in the LaGuardia bombing. He died by suicide in 2013. Irving Rubin and Earl Krugel, leaders of the JDL, responsible for numerous bombings in the 1970s and 80s, both denied involvement in LaGuardia. Krugel was murdered in prison in 2002. Rubin died by suicide in 2002, while awaiting trial. Unknown individual. In 2013, the FBI released new information suggesting the bomber might have been a lone individual with no ties to any organization. Someone who simply wanted to cause mass death and terror. But no arrests were ever made. No one was ever charged, and the case remains open. The families of the 11 dead and 74 wounded filed lawsuits against the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, TUA, and the airport security companies. They argued that the airport had failed to provide adequate security, that the coin-operated lockers were a known vulnerability, that there had been no screening or monitoring. Most of the lawsuits settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, believed to total over $10 million. But no amount of money could bring back the dead or heal the wounded. One widow said, "They gave me money, but they couldn't give me back my husband. They couldn't give my children back their father." The LaGuardia bombing led to sweeping changes in airport security nationwide. Coin-operated lockers were removed from airports across the country. Those that remained were transparent, regularly inspected, and monitored by security cameras. Security screenings were expanded. Baggage checks became standard. Random searches were introduced. But in 1975, these measures were new, untested, and incomplete. It would take decades and more attacks, including the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing in 1988 and the September 11th attacks in 2001, before airport security reached the levels we see today. The LaGuardia bombing was a warning, but it took years for anyone to truly listen. Nearly 50 years later, the LaGuardia airport bombing remains unsolved. The FBI still lists it as an active case. They still accept tips. They still investigate new leads. But the trail has gone cold. Most of the original suspects are dead. Most of the witnesses are dead. Most of the investigators who worked the case have retired or passed away. The physical evidence, fragments of the bomb, pieces of the locker, the remnants of the suitcase, has been stored in an FBI evidence warehouse in Virginia for decades. The bomber was never caught. The motive was never determined. And 11 people died for reasons no one will ever fully understand. LaGuardia Airport has been renovated multiple times since 1975. The old Tidopay terminal, the site of the bombing, was torn down and rebuilt in the 1980s and again in the 2010s. The baggage claim area was completely redesigned. The lockers, symbols of the attack, are long gone, replaced by monitored baggage storage areas and rental kiosks. Every day, 5 million people trust New York's transit system to get them where they need to go. We board trains without thinking. We stand on platforms inches from death. We walk through crowded terminals, surrounded by strangers. We sit in cabs with our backs turned. We descend into tunnels deep beneath the city. We assume we're safe. We assume the person next to us is just another commuter, just another traveler, just another New Yorker trying to get through the day. But these 7 crimes prove how dangerous that assumption can be. Bernhard Goetz shot 4 teenagers on the 2 train and forced America to confront its fears about crime, race, and vigilante justice. Was he a hero or a villain? The debate still rages. Kisa Khan was pushed onto the tracks at 49th Street, and dozens of people watched him die without lifting a finger. The photograph of his final seconds haunts us still, a reminder of the bystander effect, of our collective failure to act. Gio Valenzuela picked up 2 passengers in his livery cab and was executed for $47. His killers were never found. His family still grieves. Edward Leary turned a subway car into an inferno, trapping 48 people in a burning tunnel. His notebook revealed a man consumed by rage, determined to punish a city he believed had abandoned him. Akade strapped a bomb to his chest and walked into the Port Authority corridor, hoping to slaughter hundreds. He failed, but only because his bomb malfunctioned. The intent was clear. Colin Ferguson methodically executed 6 people on the Long Island Railroad, walking down the aisle like an executioner, shooting strangers in the head because of the color of their skin. And someone, still unknown, still unpunished, planted a bomb at LaGuardia Airport that killed 11 people and wounded 74. Nearly 50 years later, we still don't know who did it or why. The transit system is the lifeblood of New York. It's the veins and arteries that keep the city alive. But sometimes, that blood runs cold. These weren't accidents. They weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate, calculated. And if you want to keep seeing what hides in plain sight, stories that don't make headlines anymore, but still echo through the tunnels, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next signal when it comes through. This is Plain Sight Docs. Thanks for watching.